So today I want to talk a little bit about what are those opportunities, what is needed to get global voices heard, particularly from the Global South. How do we build our own capacity and also look at those capability gaps that may exist? So our panelists today, and you can see them on the screen in front of you, will really navigate those complexities, as well as the benefits of incorporating behavioral science into academia, government, the private sector, as well as the development sector. Our panelists will also reflect on their own unique experiences in driving behavioral science in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, but also bearing in mind that with all of these groups and the Global South as a whole, there are unique contextual as well as cultural nuances that are required when working in the Global South. And I think this is something that is fundamentally different from country to country, region, which really needs to be acknowledged and put into practice for how we think about programs using behavioral science. So I want to move us, over and say a big welcome to our four panelists. We've got Monica, Fadi, Pavan, and Osasuyi with us today from all parts of the globe. And I'm going to hand over to them now, starting with Monica, just to tell us a little bit more about yourself, just your name, the organization that you are representing, and also some of the broad areas of your work. So I'll hand over to you, Monica.
Thank you so much, Ammaarah. A pleasure to be here with everyone talking about this topic that is possibly one of my favorite topics of conversation. My name is Monica Silva. I am the Director of International Programs at the Behavioral Insights team, where I oversee our work in low and middle income countries, mostly focused in the EMEA region. So that is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I've been here 10 years, and I've always worked in our portfolio of work in the Global South, mostly focused in Latin America, where I'm originally from. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion.
Okay, thanks so much, Monica. Osasuyi, please, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Osasuyi Dirisu. I'm the Executive Director of the Policy Innovation Center, and we're based in Nigeria, areas where we have applied and continue to apply behavioral insights since we were created in October 2021 include health, governance, gender equity, which is something we're really passionate about, and more recently, digital inclusion. Happy to be here, looking forward to this conversation.
You're welcome, Osasuyi. We are very glad to have you here. Fadi, I'm going to move on to you just for your introduction.
So, hi, Ammaarah. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be with you. I'm Fadi Makki. I recently became Minister for Admin Reform in Lebanon. And before that, I have been doing a lot of behavioral science over the last 10 years in the Middle East. So, was the founder of Nudge Lebanon, one of the first Nudge units in that region. Also founded the FIFA World Cup Nudge unit, FIFA Development, which focused on behavioral science in the FIFA World Cup for fan engagement, for legacy around the Global South. And one of my kind of biggest passions remained behavioral science, although I had to move to a political position. But I'm here for a big show of force for your initiative, Ammaarah. You deserve so much recognition. You've been doing so much in the Global South, and here to recognize that and tell everybody to give you a big show of support.
Thank you so much, Fadi, and I really deeply appreciate that. And also thank you to you for stepping out of your ministerial role for an hour to be with us. We know there's a lot going on in Lebanon, so thank you. Pavan, please, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Ammaarah, as you can see, we are having a power cut, so I have a bit of a light shining on my face to represent the fact that we are indeed from South here. I'm delighted to be here, Ammaarah. It's such an honor to be with such eminent professionals and behaviors. I'm the director at the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University, and we are responsible for setting up India's first nudge unit out of Niti Aayog, which we did about 6 years ago. We worked very closely with the Prime Minister's office. And over the past 6 years, we have touched close to 500 million people. So based on the sheer people that we have reached, I would dare say that we are the largest nudge unit in the world. I used to be a frighteningly incompetent lawyer, And then I redefined my life to become a social scientist. I love designing experiments. But at the same time, I also like dealing with difficult government officers and government. That's what I do. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Pavan. And I think it's a bit unfair because you have 1.4 billion people. So to say you're the biggest, I'm, tongue in cheek, but certainly really, really interesting in India. Having myself for 2 years, I know that is such a big challenge, but also such opportunities. And I'm looking forward to how we take that forward in your intervention. So kick us off then. I'm going to turn to you, Fadi. You've really been a pioneer in the Middle East in the behavioral science field, having done this for many, many years. And you've somebody to bring together the best minds in the Middle East and across the global South and across the globe. You've also been so successful in bringing lesser known voices to the table and also bringing these to the global stage. So what I want to ask you today is, how do you think we can encourage more global South countries to partner, exchange, and advance together? What are those key ingredients for making partnerships work in behavioral science? And also in your view, what are pitfalls that you've seen across your work and across your career?
Thank you again. Let me give a few reflections. First, a bit on the past and some lessons learned as we kind of grew into this amazing network of behavioral science in the global South, but with a focus on the Middle East. So it all started really in around 2015 in Lebanon when we started wondering how to people behavior in specific challenges, particularly traffic and rule of law, where we had kind of very little data, very little room for maneuver, and all we had to do is really kind of bring in an innovative kind of set of tools to check what works from what does not work. So we could have started as a non-governmental organization, and then of a better location, we continued on our own, and big kind of asset for ourselves because we did not align with government, which is immediately one of the biggest problem you'll see. Leadership change meant for so many countries in our part of the world be change in kind of the champion of behavioral science, which is one of that we've heard from many in the US, in Europe, having the champion that stays, incubates that behavioral science unit, gives it the push during the incubation period. So if you have so many leadership changes, that's going to affect you negatively. So we did suffer a bit of that, and the choice of having it outside government was really a great idea. And we've seen others also succeed in this regard. Some of the universities, the leading universities in the Middle East who behavioral science initiative in their campuses were also kind of successful in the sense that they survived the political leader change. So that initial period, we saw in that part of the world a lot of kind of outside government initiatives. And when the idea matured, we started seeing things really at the top. So we started seeing prime ministers setting up national behavioral science unit. We started seeing rulers, emirs, kind of, and others, leaders set up behavioral science unit. What we've seen also is at some stage when the idea 3-4 years into kind of existence started kind of maturing, we started seeing more decentralized models. The Saudi example is the best example, where you have literally almost every ministry setting up its own kind of behavioral science unit with a very focused mandate on culture, on electricity, on human resources, on entrepreneurship, and so on. Now, with that is immediately the next thing. Is there room for still behavioral science units at the top? Not so much as we had at the beginning, but there's still room, particularly to focus on maybe setting standards for decentralized behavioral science unit. the work that is not done by any ministry, particularly cross-agency behavioral science initiative that cut across multiple ministries, cultural change in particular, and in particular, kind of doing the projects that kind of transcend one particular ministry. Now, one of the kind of important things that we started doing, and I think many have picked up, is the collaboration South-South, which is going to be really the most important thing that I want to leave from this session. You remember you were one of the first with us also in kind of the first big event in our part of the world, was Arabia 2018. That was an amazing thing. We did 2019, 2020, 2021. And now there are so many fora. So we're excited to have been the incubators of this, but we need to continue it. It's important to continue it because this is probably one of the key ingredients for the success of behavioral science, especially growing ones, especially ones that kind of are startups. So there's a lot of kind of few guys from others. So initiatives such as yours is extremely important, and important not only to do capacity building and supporting lessons learned, but do collaborative initiatives, things that cut across the one country, and things that are among global South country, but also in comparison with the other countries. So it's important to launch initiative, a lot of research related to behavioral science. Sports is one of those areas where I think there's going to be a lot of behavioral science on, because fan engagement end to end would require a lot of work, not only during the sports event, which could kind of give rise to so many behaviors that require adjustment, from sustainability to healthy eating to even security and compliance aspects, but also beyond, because sports is an anchor for so much change that we could build on top of it, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's culture. One thing that kind of is extremely important is also in this regard is the importance of looking at, of course, we always say, look at best in class, but that best in class might not be only in Finland, Singapore, UK, and the US. It could be next door to one of those global South countries that have risen through the ranks, that have done it the hard way, learned so much on the back of failing forward. So extremely important to document those lessons learned, share it among kind of the global South, and create, just like many behavioral scientists have done. You were part of the WHO kind of lessons learned. There's so many countries that the World Bank has done, but it's important to do South specific lessons learned of how to create behavioral sciences, how to a lot of the do's and don'ts in this regard. A lot of mindset change that need to be taught to policymakers to agree to be entrepreneurial, to agree to want to experiment, to agree to be humble and modest, because what works is not what we think works, but what's tested to work. But it's also extremely important to change the skill set. So after all, there's a lot of technical skills that need to be brought into kind of the mindset. Yes, you have to be ready to accept those experimental methods, but you have to be taught those. And there's also, you need to think how civil service of those global South governments. How do you bring universities? How do you create experiential courses with your support? How do you bring it into schools as well? Because kind of teaching that experimental mindset for kids early on, like we've done in some schools, is just amazing to see that happening. I will stop here and would be kind of be part of any further discussion. But my final word is collaboration, cross-country collaboration, making learnings kind of easy to grasp, and kind of supporting in a lot of do's and don'ts for a lot of the aspiring behavioral scientists in our part of the world. And don't shy away from looking at countries that are in the global south, because there's so many learning, it's so contextual that you could get so much more from those countries than from the best in class out there.
Fadi, such wonderful nuggets of wisdom to be able to take back. And I think what really struck me about what you said is, looking at the best practices from the global south. I think too often we are going to, of course, there's a multitude of wonderful behavioral scientists there, but we don't always look at what is actually in our backyard. And I think also the point that you're documenting those lessons learned and really making sure that we actually distribute and disseminate them to make sure that we're hearing those lessons and not always looking to one thing that you also said about setting standards, at the end of the day, we are new to behavioral science. A lot of us, some of us have been around. I still remember the BX Arabia conferences with much sort of a way to meet people that I would have never ordinarily met, just because I didn't know that they existed. So I think in terms of just being able to that bridge and bring people together is such an important skill. So thank you very much for those useful and examples and recommendations from the Middle East. So to now turn over to you, Monica, just to talk a little bit about your work. Of course, being from Colombia and had in many countries in Latin America, what have you seen as the most inherent complexities in working in Latin America? And, are years for navigating these in a contextually and culturally sensitive manner. And knowing that, culture and context is so for the work that we do in the Global South. Not every country is the same, not every region is the same. So I wanted to hear more of your thoughts there.
Thank you so much, Ammaarah. And if I may just start with an anecdote, actually, because that you were making and that Fadi was also making just now about the lessons from the...
Monica, you've cut out a little bit. And we've also lost the visual. While we're waiting for Monica to join us and to come back, Fadi, there was a question in the chat for you, and maybe just for us to maybe take that one. From Hussein. Hussein, I'm not sure where you're dialing in from, but your question is, how can governments in the GCC be encouraged to consider behavioral insights as a tool to better understand changing identity norms within their unique demographic? Thanks, Hussein from Bahrain. Over to you, Fadi.
This is a very challenging topic across all GCC. I know all GCC countries are talking about change at the cultural level, change in the way we perceive others, the way we react to other communities, the way we look at subsidies, the way we look at the role of the state. So really hardcore cultural change that go to the way we live and kind of engage with rules and regulations and others around us. And one of the things that kind of I was dealing with when I was in my previous consulting role is to really start with a proper baseline assessment of what do people know about others, about cultures, perceptions, and willingness, knowledge, attitudes, and practices, exercise, but across the board, just to see what is it that people know, because there could be some misperception about what you know, and you could correct that. But then correcting knowledge is one thing, collecting perceptions also you could start testing as you go how far you could go in changing perceptions, updating norms, correct the myth about certain things. So that's extremely important, and that's the sort of thing, to answer another question, that could be done cross country. So it would be great to do to really think about perceptions of key challenges of sustainability, of littering, of major mega challenges, see how that changes around the world, and just compare, and then get people to react or update people's perception about what we know or we think India kind of does, or their people does, or kind of other GC countries or other places in Africa. So it's important to just kind of confront people with their own perceptions and with the reality, and that's what change starts to happen. So I do encourage you to also work with Nudge Lebanon, among other places where a lot of work has been happening over the last 10 years. And just want to tell you that I have stepped down from Nudge Lebanon, from the baby that I founded 10 years ago, but it's there alive. Would encourage you to collaborate with that. Ali has taken over as the new chair. With them, there's Nabil and Aya, some of the old guards who are there. So cross-country collaboration across Nudge units is extremely important. I call on you to do that. And you have to end this session with at least one initiative, Ammaarah. So you have less than 40 minutes to think of something.
Thank you so much for that, Fadi. And also thanks to Hussein for your very thoughtful question. I think Monica's back, so I'm going to go straight to her now. Technical things always happen, so here we are. And being in the Global South, this is always going to happen. You saw Pavan's lights going out. Happens a lot in South Africa as well. So Monica, over to you.
Don't blame it on the Global South. I'm in London. Yeah.
I was trying to give you like an avenue to get out of it, but yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. I was late to a tech chat, hoping that it wouldn't fail yet. Here we are. Sorry about that, but I'm fully back now. And I was about to dive into an anecdote, actually, because I wanted to start with an anecdote, thinking about this reflection about what the Global South can teach or share with the Global North. When I joined Beth over 10 years ago, and when I came here like full of motivations, really driven to see what work we could do in Latin America and like the Global South more generally. And in my interview, I thought it was self-evident that they would know the example of Antanas Mockus, who's a mayor in Bogota. I'll tell you about in a minute. And I just talked about him in the interview as expecting my now colleagues to know about it. And they had absolutely no clue what I was talking about. And that was really surprising to me back then, because Antanas Mockus is the reason I am here right now. In case you don't know, so Antanas Mockus was the mayor that Bogota had in the 90s. It's mayor we had in Colombia at a time when Bogota was one of the most dangerous cities in the world. We had a very high homicide rate. We were in the middle of like quite a life civil war, basically. And he came in with an alternative approach to public policy, and he started changing people's behaviors. Just to give you two examples, one is one that I really often think about, because I remember being a 5-year-old girl in the back of my mom's car, and he had given drivers cards to give each other feedback while driving to improve drivers' behavior. And I remember being given that card with a thumbs up and a thumbs down, and showing it to the truck driver, showing it to the bus driver, showing it to people around me all the time, and kind of seeing how that was changing behavior. He created things like group incentives. There was a water crisis at a time, and one of the main water pipes broke for like the sort of water system in Bogota. And what he did was he created incentives within the neighborhoods to get them to compete against each other as to which one could save more water. And he did very creative things like going on TV butt naked to promote people like actually showering and so on. And so he was just like this sort of example that really was in my mind as I was learning. As I was learning about behavioral science, as I was like being motivated by this sort of overlap between really interesting, rigorous research based on theories about human behavior and this pragmatic approach of policymaking, and really seeing it live, changing people's behaviors and then having an impact. And then as I start working in this field initially here from London, I realized that was not a well-known example. And like Antanas Mockus's case, which is from the 90s, we frequently talk about this field as is like relatively recent, but there's examples that go far back from the Global South that are very interesting, that we can carry on, continue like amplifying and then learning from. And so that's the one from Colombia. If you don't know about him, I really recommend looking him up. The World Development Report in 2015 covered one of his case studies as well. So if you want to learn about him, that's a good place to start, basically. Now, going back to your question, Ammaarah, in terms of like, what are the sort of challenges that I've identified working in Latin America and in the Global South, trying to apply behavioral science to deliver impact? It's a question I think a lot about, especially in the context of thinking about reaching impact at scale, not just discretely to like one or two projects, but how do we make sure that behavioral science is delivering its promise in the longer term, if that makes sense? So how do we make sure that we're creating sustainable change and sort of reaching that sort of impact at scale? One thing that we come across frequently and that we've come across in our portfolio in Latin America is this question around representation and access. And essentially this means that we think a lot about like not the population just as a whole, but the sort of subgroups of the population that you're trying to serve, and how, because of various reasons, so for instance, the geography in Colombia is quite complex, so getting to certain groups of the population is harder, or because of data issues, or because of which voices are louder or more connected to the center of the country itself, there tends to be an underrepresentation of certain groups of the population. And so while you're coming in to think about these projects, it's quite good to kind of try and zoom out before you zoom in and try and think about the distribution of the population as a whole and how you make sure that you're bringing in those groups across the population. So to give you an example, one project that we did in Colombia was focusing on a very wide challenge of anti-corruption. And so what we were trying to do initially was to try and map out the potential instances where our project could be viable, like both feasible and could deliver impact from a behavioral science perspective. We ended up working with the Ministry of Education in the schools meals program. And the project initially did this sort of mapping exercise that I'm describing, where you go from trying to understand the whole problem from the provider's perspective, the procurement process, the delivery of the meals and the schools, and how the interaction between the children and the parents was like before we decided which one was the behavioral target we were going to focus on. Through that process, we uncovered, through qualitative work, all sorts of challenges that I don't think you would have come across in our context, or they would have had a different shape. So for instance, in terms of delivery of the meals, you would have things whereby it takes 3 to 4 days to get to a school to deliver some of the meals. And that includes crossing 3 rivers and then also having to deliver a part of it through like a canoe and so on. And the meals that the ministry was intentionally designing to be quite nutritious didn't necessarily reflect the local ingredients that were available in the local economy. Therefore, that created some challenges and barriers for the providers themselves. And so you kind of go about uncovering this sort of like richness in the diversity of a country like Colombia, that sometimes means that it's harder to get to certain groups of the population. It's harder to make sure that like groups of the population are accurately represented. And in the context of delivery and thinking about how to reach to those groups, it's harder to get to a place. And you can also think about things like accessibility, connectivity, and making sure that like literacy, if those groups of the population don't have the level of literacy for an intervention that you're designing, then tailoring it to the local needs. Another challenge that we found, and I think this will resonate beyond Latin America probably, is how the sort of cycles we face politically and from the funding perspective not necessarily match the timelines that you require to deliver impact. And so it might be that, say, for instance, we worked quite a bit on setting up behavioral insights team across the world. We've set up over 10 teams in like Bangladesh, Guatemala, Indonesia, in Australia, in Singapore, here in the UK, quite a few. And what I mean by that essentially is that sometimes you can really work hard to install this capacity. And that might mean getting the right talent from the local population, training people up, setting data systems and so on. And then the government changes and it all kind of falls apart. So a challenge that we face essentially is that sometimes those political cycles come at a time when you're trying to install that capacity and then can be hard to overcome. And what we've done in that space is try and create systems across those teams and try and be a little bit less reliant on individuals themselves. So like individuals tend to be great sponsors for this sort of project, to try and create systems that like are more resilient. I think that is sort of a challenge. The sort of timelines and political cycles do not really match each other necessarily. And on the funding side of things, you might get funders that say give you funding for like 1-2 years, and you really want to see long-term outcomes, right? You don't want to just see if this project shifted and the number of mothers taking their children to get vaccinated, but you also want to see, even in the long run, the children are better off health-wise, and in the long run, they're doing better, like well-being-wise, and so on. So we not always have the ability to check on the sort of long-term impact of these interventions, and that's not so much because we don't want to do it or the data is not there, is because sometimes the funding doesn't really match the sort of expectations, and the political cycle can be a bit of a challenge there as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, and the last point on the sort of scaling is one that like really matches what John List's been talking about in his book Voltage Effect, which I really recommend people look into if they're interested in the sort of challenge of scaling and delivering impact at scale. And is that we sometimes create really perfect and pristine experiments to give our interventions the best chance to be successful in this sort of context, but then we're not necessarily thinking about what are the conditions we'll need to fulfill for this to deliver impact at scale. So especially if you're thinking in the context of the Global South, if you're delivering an intervention that relies on teachers, you need to think about not only the 5,000 teachers in your sample, you need to think about like the 50,000 teachers or the like 100,000 teachers that you're going to need to deliver this intervention within the whole of the country, and how you're going to train them up and so on. So I think there is something around trying to bring in that element of scalability within the initial thinking of our projects that I think sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. And you wanted to come in, Ammaarah, I'm going to pause there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Monica. And I think some really useful and practical points, again, about making sure that when you are implementing, to take into account those structural challenges as well. Yes, of course, all of us on the call want to change behavior, but you can only do that within the structural domains of the community or the area that you're working in. And I think your point about, having people crossing a river, very important. There could be other things. There could be political violence. There might be money issues to get somebody to a particular facility to do a program. So I think these things are important, and you touched on these in terms of scale and scalability. Always thinking about not just the pilot, but also how do we look at scale? Because the pilot definitely looks very different to the scaled up version. And so making sure that we're thinking about these sort of considerations, not just only about how do we change behavior, but how do we also look at the context and the environment. And I think your point also about political considerations, something that Fadi talked about as well, really thinking through how do we get it to stick once a four-year term is done, or once a 5-year term is done. How do you actually have those champions, as Fadi mentioned, to be able to push the work forward? Also thinking through not just on the political level, but also on the administration level, to say, who in the government do I need to convince to be able to take my message forward to push behavioral science to the next level? So thanks a lot for that, Monica. I am now swiftly going to move on to Osasuyi and the work that you are doing in Nigeria. Osasuyi, your experience at the Policy Innovation Center has largely focused on how behavior change can be infused into policy implementation as well as regulation, including across various areas like health, gender equity, digital inclusion, as well as governance. What I want to pose to you today, Osasuyi, is, a lot of your work in Nigeria focuses on gender equity, which is such an important aspect and theme running across the whole of the Global South. What for you would be those essential ingredients for advancing equity through your work? And also, what are some of the hardest things that have been for you in terms of implementing those projects? So over to you. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Ammaarah. It's really great to be here. Before I answer your question, just to lay a foundation as to our context, first of all, our center is fairly new, for 3.5 years. set up in October 2021. But really, that's why it's good to have these conversations where you're speaking to people who are able to relate, your journey. So, running or setting up experiments and trying to demonstrate evidence, for public policy, using behavioral insights in our context is completely different from what you would see in a typical context. Because first of all, we're dealing with a lot of things. First of all, we have to think about the perceptions, around the use of behavioral science. What does it mean to a policymaker? What does that approach mean? Why should they be interested? How do we break it down to ensure that it's simple, easy to understand? Because even when you talk about advocating for gender equity, once you mention the word gender, everybody's antennas are up. What are you going to talk about? Are you, a lot of misconceptions to correct. So what has worked in our experience is, first of all, laying a foundation even as a center. And that involved a lot of advocacy around mindset shift, trying to solve for transformational leadership. Because if you have leadership that does not see the demand for advancing health, gender, governance issues, and then that becomes a problem. And then one of the things that we've also reflected would work in our context is creating platforms for sustained dialogue. And that's why we have the Gender and Inclusion Summit, so that every year we can bring everyone together to really reflect on the learnings, but bring people thinking about it in different ways. And then also bring policymakers into that co-creation process, because it's not enough to take the evidence, to meet them and expect that to be accepted. But just speaking broadly for agenda work, over the past few years, we've had an opportunity to work across very challenging areas, advancing women in economic leadership. Participation of women in parliament in Nigeria is barely 3%, issues relating to women's economic empowerment, even increasing demand for health, agricultural services. And one of the things that has worked for us is, first of all, laying that foundation. So we created our own approach that is bottom-up. So for everything we're working on, rather than starting from a lab experiment or starting from those models, we first go and try to even engage, get the locals to understand what we're trying to do, and get the insights that we would feed even into designing the sort of approaches that we would use. I mean, when you're speaking to even things like, some work we did recently on solving for foundational identity. One of the things that we found in our work is that the women who need foundational identity to access bank accounts and to improve livelihoods may not even see that through the lens of need, because they may feel disempowered if I get a foundational ID, I open a bank account, and then I become homeless tomorrow because my spouse feels that I'm too empowered to be in his house. So we just to say that we're solving a lot more basic problems than someone, for example, in the global north doing BI for foundational identity or to improve economic inclusion will be thinking about. So that intentionality to bring those things down and then begin to build from up. One of the things that's also worked for us is capacity building, because gender equity is such a difficult concept to understand, because people think it's about empowering women over men and leaving one sector behind. So in our work, we had to do quite a lot of capacity building. We've had to also build a lot of partnerships. So when we started the Policy Innovation Center, for the first few months, we were just holding design workshops. These were free workshops that people could come in, sit down in very easy, basic ways, understand what behavioral science is all about, bring the stakeholders into the room, and get them to begin to reflect on the need to even go create the solutions in the first place. Otherwise, you come back with the evidence and you don't have a ready maker or a ready ecosystem to take up that ecosystem. One of the things we did in 2023 was to build a learning management system, some of these courses online, to also make it a lot more affordable, because in-person courses to build capacity around behavioral science is also something very challenging. And then just to speak to what has been most challenging for us, one, you would expect to just have administrative data on the most basic thing to work with. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So even something as simple as registration, getting people's data, even people trusting the fact that you're going to use their data properly impacts on data collection. So then deeply rooted social norms, of course. And many times when I talk about social norms, everyone is thinking about in the rural areas. No. A person who comes with patriarchy from a rural area and then becomes a political leader will take that mindset right into the policy space. So it's debiasing people's assumptions around gender equity. That's also something that we see as a problem. And then funding, a lot of the work we do is funded from grants from the global north. So that tension around having the conversation to ensure that you are infusing an approach that would work, will be impactful. And when you finish your pilot, you are able to put in some measure of sustainability into how you're looking at taking this on the long term. We try in our work not to design bogus, expensive, very unsustainable work, because we know that funding is a challenge. And we want to ensure that we can maximize donor funding to do a lot more. And then, of course, poor infrastructure. When you're going to work across, our work is more expensive because you have to think about transportation, access. You can't sit behind your desk and deploy a survey online. Sometimes you really have to be boots on the ground to collect data, with something around just understanding readiness. Last year, and we had to survey almost 10,000 people, and we had to go to 18 region, 18 centers within a certain region to collect data in person, because we're actually working with the most vulnerable groups. And poor resource prioritization. And then finally, I think one of our biggest problems is really identifying transformational leadership. So really having leaders in decision-making spaces who already take the evidence around behavior and can take some of the insights from our work and take those insights into trying to make real lasting change. But one of the things, like I said, we're doing a lot more is building capacity at different levels, at the level of the policymaker, at the level of the implementers, at the level of people that we're trying to serve, and ensuring that we're co-creating an ethical version of behavioral science and its applications in Nigeria, and then, of course, in Africa as a whole.
Great. Thank you so much for those points, Osasuyi. I think a lot of important things that you mentioned. And just to say, dealing with gender equity in Africa is exceptionally difficult. Being South African and also knowing those gender dynamics which come through time and time again, especially if you're trying to design programs and projects, is so important to recognize. So, I liked your points about the co-creation process, making sure that people are actually with you from the bottom up, getting the basics right and making sure that you understand exactly what is going on in your communities before you sort of come in with, these are the plans and this is what we're trying to do. Your point, I think, about access to data across the Global South, I think it's a challenge, whether it's admin data or other data. Just having reliable data is really, but this is why, for example, we need to start pushing that agenda to how do we collect the data? How do we make sure that there's quality behind it? And I think this is so important. You touched also on a very important point, and I think it comes back to Pravin's question about those ethical considerations and sort of, especially when dealing with vulnerable, low trust populations. I think you eloquently really touched on that and gave us some good insight there. So at this point, I want to move over, talking about data and evidence and to Pavan. And really just to, you are working in India and you've been working at the intersection of academia, public policy and experimentation for several years in India, as well as in the broader Global South. And we know there is a growing body of locally run RCTs and behavioral diagnostics, but the findings are often fragmented and not disseminated widely. And we heard a bit about this through Fadi's intervention. So what I want to know from Pavan is, what do you think the opportunities are to improve the evidence and build capability in behavioral science locally in the Global South without having to always rely on external partners, which often, quite frankly, cost a fortune? So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts here. So over to you.
Oh, thank you, Ammaarah. I hope you can hear me clearly.
You are loud and clear, yes.
Good. So, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I have two or three main theses to put forward. First, in terms of types of data that we have collected, the types of inferences that we have drawn, it varies across the methods that we have used. I mean, you have some RCTs of the type that, the JPAL runs, which get published in the American Economic Review, which policymakers barely read. And then you have the sort of the qualitative work that gets done as diagnostics. So there's a high degree of variation in the quality of empirics as it is produced in Global South. So it's not really publishing these results out there or bringing them out there. I think there's a challenge, or perhaps there's a reluctance to bring out data that filters through the lens of this conflict between the empirical world and the bureaucratic world. These are two different types of ethos. The empirical world, as all of you know, is based on the idea of falsification, the Popperian idea of falsification. You have a hypothesis and you strive to show that it doesn't work. However, invested you are in the intervention. Whereas the bureaucracy, that we engage with, is the ethos of that is fundamentally based on corroboration, where you have to support the idea that is put forward in a hierarchy, ostensibly to reduce transaction costs within the organization and so on. Now, these two cultures collide. And when these two cultures collide, it impacts the kind of empirics that we do, right? And something that you need to bear in mind. And hierarchy, bureaucracy, that particular feature in India is pretty intense. And so oftentimes you may do great work, but the rate of absorption by the government tends to be somewhat reduced because it doesn't necessarily corroborate their inferences that they've drawn through professional empiricism. I draw a distinction between scientific empiricism and professional empiricism. Scientific empiricism, you randomize and so on and so forth, whereas professional empiricism is based on selection bias. Bureaucrats meet people and there's a selection effect. There's a conflict of interest, and the kind of information that they surround themselves tends to be a bubble. So the quality of work suffers on account of that. Notwithstanding that, we do manage to get some stuff out, which we are pretty proud to put out there, right? So it's not as if we don't want to put our empirics out, but it's that we are constrained by the quickness with which we have to respond to the government. And as academics, we don't feel quite comfortable to publish that stuff, right? So that's the first challenge. The second big thesis that I have relates to heterogeneity. I mean, we've talked about it. It's the context which matters. And India is a country which is like 20 countries packed into one. And so the amount of heterogeneity that we have is immense, right? So we are literally dealing with a division that, we've somehow managed to divide ourselves in a million creative ways, and that poses a challenge. Now, heterogeneity is interesting. You can find something that works in a particular area, but it need not work in a different area, especially if the particular aspects of that particular area interact with the intervention, right? Now, I need to draw a distinction between heterogeneity on one hand. We have made given a lot of importance to heterogeneity, the weird samples and so on. But human beings are also more common. I dare say they're more common than they're actually different. And so there's a fundamental aspect of behavior science where, things work in identical ways across the country or perhaps across the world. So the exoticization of enclaves, I think, is a tendency that can actually take us away from doing good, solid, foundational work in behavior science in the Global South. While at the same time, you need to be mindful of heterogeneity, especially if it interacts with treatments, right? That's the second big thesis that I have. The third relates to the ethics of it, right? You already brought it out, Ammaarah, and Osasuyi has also brought this out very eloquently, and that is, we are dealing with truly vulnerable populations who are under a tremendous cognitive load, and they can make decisions which are not necessarily protecting of their autonomy. So the big ethical question for us is, how far can we push our interventions? How far can we try and do things which are not backed by some kind of constitutional consensus in some sense? So unless we bring in the legal framework, unless we bring in the ethical framework to substantiate what we do, and I think that's a good idea to run a nudge unit in the country without a legal or a constitutional process informing us as to whether what we're doing is right or wrong. I'll give you a very quick example. We've invested in AI, and we built a model which basically detects whether a woman is a victim of domestic violence or not, because they don't reveal it. When self-reporting, it's completely underreported. So we built a little app where a frontline health worker can go in and ask a few innocuous questions, and we determine with a fairly high degree of accuracy as to whether she's a victim of violence. Now, we are able to elicit that inference, but without her permission in some sense. So there's a conflict on one hand between serving the person and perhaps saving her from a grave form of injustice, but simultaneously, maybe there's a lashback effect that she might suffer. So how do you balance between these two ends is likely to be and I think we need to pay particular attention to autonomy and cognitive load when we are dealing with poor people. It becomes very, very true that, and we need to back our work with some constitutionalism, some thinking, and so on. The final thought that I have that I would like to share, and this is actually a hope that I seek, and this comes from the perspective of Senthil Mullainathan, who's an AI guy now. And one of the lovely things that he said, and this is something that we are embracing very well, and that is machine learning is able to reconcile heterogeneity. And for the first time, you're able to actually make sociology a really rigorous quantitative model building exercise, because your right-hand side, the number of variables that you have in your equation can now be accommodated in your model, in your crazy model, right? So there's a lot of hope in bringing AI into behavior science, and that's the area of intersection, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful intersection to explore, especially in the context of Global South, where I believe heterogeneity is quite an intense phenomenon. It's not to say that there's no heterogeneity in the United States or in West. My intuition tells me that the heterogeneity in a country like India is pretty intense on a relative scale. But we now have the quantitative, and analytical tools that can actually build models to capture this complexity, and that can be really, really rewarding. That's investment into. Let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavan, and again, giving us some food for thought. I think the point you make about ethics, of course, very, very important. Also, this idea that, of course, the Global South is not a homogenous group. And even within countries, there are differences. A country like India with so many languages, so many states, so many different things, like you say, many different countries in so much for sharing. And a big thank you to our panelists for those sort of useful and thoughtful and insightful comments. We've seen a couple of questions coming through in the chat. There was one in particular by Dilip. Dilip, I'm not sure if you want to mention it and sort of just ask to the panel yourself, or if you'd like me just to go ahead, you can just say yes or no.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I guess what I was saying is there is obviously a lot of research showing that decision-making is predicated on people's beliefs and decision-making styles and tendencies, things like risk aversion and so on and so forth. And if there's been any concerted effort by any of your units or anything that you're aware of that measures these things, and ideally it could be done in a cross-cultural setting. And I guess I just remarked that Fadi wanted us to come up with and this might be one, is if we can document some of these basic behavioral tendencies across countries.
Thanks so much for that, Dilip. Pavan, do you want to maybe take a stab, and then I'm also going to give you opportunity to others.
So this is something that we are already doing. We have run a massive survey now to measure social norms relating to climate action, just kind of a large end kind of a thing across the country. There's another project where we have bridged the gap between experiments and surveys, because experiments need to be replicated 1 million times before you're able to measure stuff across a large population. So we're trying to find correlates between experimental outcomes and what we can do with surveys, and plug the questions that are successful in experiments in a survey. We are doing this project with Collegio in Italy. And soon after that, what we're going to do is validate our instrument, our survey instrument, to then be able to measure social norms, particularly gender-based social norms across the country by using an instrument can be more easily administered than experiments. So that's the exciting things that we're doing. I don't know if I've answered Dilip.
No, I was just like, you spoke about heterogeneity, and there's obviously heterogeneity in context, but there is obviously heterogeneity in the decision maker themselves. And I think a systematic way of measuring these beliefs might actually allow us to make comparisons between jurisdictions and say, well, it looks like people in South Korea behave a lot like people in North Nigeria. I'm making this up. And so it's easier to translate across those geographies. So some kind of a nice organized way, I think, would be pretty cool.
We are indeed doing that. We actually going through the exercise of building personas across the entire country for our gender norms and so on.
Great. Thanks, Pavan. And as we close the panel, maybe just for all of you, just also, kind of your action item, spurred on by Dirisu as well as Fadi, and maybe just to ask Osasuyi what.
Thank you so much. So in terms of my action item and, reflecting on what Dylan talked about, I something that we're already infusing into our work, looking for that opportunity to see what that looks cross-nationally. So, for example, right now we're conducting a national survey and we're measuring norms across 5 domains among very young adolescents. So looking at gender-based violence, child and early forced marriage, women economic empowerment, SRH, and uptake of HPV vaccination. And one of the things we put intentionally into the design of this work is ensuring that we can look at the commonalities and then we can look at the differences or the heterogeneities. And the aim of this is to be able to say, because intervention design becomes a lot more complex when within a country of 200 million people, you have to almost design per small region or design. So how do we bring this and think about an integrated approach to now use behavioral science when we go into the second year where we will now be designing interventions to ensure that we're designing interventions that work, but also provide opportunities for cross-learning. So I think what this has done for me is just giving us that opportunity to think broadly now beyond Nigeria, and I mean, learning from some of the things Pavan has talked about today, and begin to see what that looks, across the Global South, and how we can bring all those lessons into improving our work, but also developing frameworks that now work for how we translate evidence into public policy in the Global South.
Thank you so much for that, Osasuyi. Really useful points. Fadi, do you maybe want to come in just with some last words as we look to close the panel, just in terms of those sort of important action items that you think should be taking back? And I know I'm throwing it back to you, but I think important for others as a community and as a collective. Fadi, maybe just tied down. Monica, maybe let's just go to you and just do a quick reflection before we close.
Thanks, Ammaarah, and thank you so much for holding and hosting this space. My plea was gonna be for us to do more of this, basically. I think it's wonderful to be able to learn from each other. I think it's wonderful to be able to hear from each other. I would love to see more South collaborations, more panels, more of us speaking to each other. I think one thing that's been really evident in the last 10 years for me through the work that I've done across almost 30 countries is that there's a lot of richness in the talent that is out there. There's a lot of people working really hard to achieve impact within this context. And I think we should just be amplifying their voices more, giving them more platforms. And to that note, I posted in the channel the link to a conference we're hosting in Colombia next week, actually, which is going to be the third gathering of behavioral science in Latin America, together with the mayor's office, the Los Andes University, which is a really well-renowned university there, and an organization called Confama. And it'll be great to see people there. We'll have it in both English and Spanish, and it gives you a nice, very actionable next step after this, basically.
Great, fantastic, Monica. Thank you so much for that. I see Faisal has dropped something in the chat, just saying that a quick idea would be for us to develop a charter on how to do BI in the Global South. Recommendation, Faisal. Maybe you just want to say hi to us, if you're there.
Yeah, I am. No, hi. No, fantastic panel. I mean, essentially, the whole reason I thought about that, and this follows various conversations I've had with a number of people on the screen, and hi to everyone. I think it's about some of the politics of not having BI done to the Global South, but rather the Global South doing BI. And I think one of the issues is that often it's funded by donors from the Global North. And I think there has to be something about the Global South, given the richness of the experience that is here in the panel and probably elsewhere as well, to be able to start to make a stand and say, well, if we're going to do it, this is the way it needs to be done. So I think it's kind of partly political, partly technocratic, but potentially something that this group and this conversation could continue with.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think we have our marching orders and a lot to start off with. Of course, we can't do everything at the same time. And if there's anything that you learn from working in the Global South, is slow and steady until things work. And if they don't work, you just go back and you try again. So I think thanks for that. Thanks so much to our panel. I think very insightful feedback and comment, and also, just your own lived experiences of how to do behavioral science in the Global South. And I know from working in the space for more than 10 years, it's not easy, but it's super rewarding. And I think for me, there's nothing else that I would rather do than to spend my time here and see how we can change behaviors and also think about those structural factors that go along with it. So I wanted to wrap us up and just hand over very quickly to Devyani just to tell you a little bit more about our next steps. And what we've got planned. I do note all the questions in the chat. We will try to sort of get that answered from the panelists, but thank you all for participating, and I hand over to Devyani.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists for such an engaging, such a fantastic conversation. I won't take more than 2 minutes just to help us close. Again, like everyone said, echoing everyone's statements, this is such an important conversation to start. What Ammaarah said at the beginning of the conversation and what Faisal said now about doing the behavior science ourselves rather than having it done to us. So really, we're hoping that this group becomes a catalyst for, for, with, and to Global South and behavior science. To that end, what we're hoping specifically is that everyone who's joined today can help us with forming regional chapters for more collaboration. Like Monica said, there's already an event happening in Colombia. We have some local chapters as best in Latin America. We also have some groups in other parts of the world, and we have some groups that are working on special interest areas. If there's anything in particular that you would like to work on, and if you are interested in setting up a local chapter, please do write to us. You already have our email address up on the screen. And if we go to the next slide, thank you so much, Amelia. We have a small QR code through which you can join a WhatsApp group. This will help us to engage more actively so that we can develop more ideas, possibly develop the charter that Faisal and Dilip are talking about, or the manifesto, depending on what we choose to call it. But we're hoping that more of you can join this conversation and we can begin to talk about what methods, what innovations, and what ideas for the Global South can look like, which are more homegrown and come from all of us who actually live here, who are working in this very heterogeneous, very complicated, very layered ecosystem. So again, thank you all so much. Back to you, Ammaarah, for any last thoughts and closing.
Great. Thank you so much, Devyani. So please do join the WhatsApp group. There was a question in the chat about how do we actually keep in contact. This is probably the most effective way in the Global South that I've seen. It's a business tool, it's a social tool, but it's an effective tool. Love it or hate it. And we promise we won't be spamming you at all. It's just to give you information. It's about how to connect and also how do we take this group forward. Because for us, it's not just about us telling you what to do and sort of this is happening, but how do we co-create things? And I think this was certainly a big theme coming out of today. So just to say a big thank you, first of all, to everybody on the call. Secondly, a big thank you to our panelists for being here and taking the time to spend with us today. And we're hoping that this will be the first of many. And you'll go on this journey. And I think we will, we are going to be evolving. We are going to be learning from each other. So really excited to have you all with us, and I'm looking forward to the next session. So please do connect, and we'll chat soon and see you soon.